Wendy Grenade, and I'm your chair for the evening. Professor V. Udine Barito, Pro Vice Chancellor and Principal, Ambassador Roland Bullin, former U.S. Ambassador to Guyana, and Mrs. Bullin, other members of the Diplomatic Corps, Dr. Justin Robinson, Dean, Faculty of Social Sciences, Dr. Tennyson Joseph, Head, Department of Government, Sociology, Social Work, and Psychology. Our featured speaker, Professor David Hines, Associate Professor, African and African American Studies Unit, School for Social Transformation at Arizona State University. Professor Emeritus Andrew Downs, former PVC Planning. Mrs. June Emmanuel, wife of the late Dr. Patrick Emmanuel. Present and former colleagues of the UWI family, members of the Grenada and Guyana Associations of Barbados, members of the Grenada and Guyana Students Association at Cave Hill, members of the Cave Hill Association of Postgraduate Students, all our undergraduate students, welcome, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Welcome again to the 12th Patrick A.M. Emmanuel Memorial Lecture. I thank all of you for being here with us this evening. I wish to take this opportunity to remember our sisters and brothers throughout the Caribbean and the diaspora who experienced the recent devastating effects of Hurricanes Irma and Maria. We pledge our continued support to them in keeping with the Caribbean's tradition of solidarity. As the University of the West Indies, we are committed to intellectual discourse and public scholarship. We take seriously our collective responsibility to nourish this Caribbean region with ideas and concrete action as we endeavor to find Caribbean solutions for Caribbean problems. At the Cave Hill campus, we take seriously our scholarly responsibility to specifically engage Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean. The late Dr. Patrick Emmanuel, whose life, work, and memory we honor this evening, was relentless in reminding the University of the West Indies about its responsibility to the Eastern Caribbean. Many of our young students may ask, who was Dr. Patrick Emmanuel? And why a memorial lecture in his name? Dr. Emmanuel was Caribbean, Grenadian, and a long-standing member of the UWI community. He was a consummate researcher. In delivering the 10th Patrick Emmanuel Memorial Lecture, Professor Udine Barito reminded us of Dr. Emmanuel's collective body of work, which he classified into the following 9 thematic areas: Caribbean political integration, governance and democracy, political and economic systems of small island states of the Commonwealth Caribbean, size and sovereignty, theoretical and practical dimensions, electoral systems in the Commonwealth Caribbean, electoral behavior and public opinion, public policy and governmental bureaucracy, UWI and higher education in the Caribbean, and importantly, the study and scientific analysis of elections. Public scholars, such as the late Dr. Emmanuel, blazed the intellectual trail in the immediate post-independence period. What type of Caribbean polity, economy, and society? How should an independent people be governed? These were some of the questions they sought to interrogate. In referring to the pre-independence period, Dr. Patrick Emmanuel argued that it became deeply ingrained in the Caribbean political consciousness that the stability and legitimacy of the political systems depended both on the enjoyment of political freedoms per se and on the capacity of the political system to generate tolerable improvements in the material well-being of Caribbean peoples. End of quote. Emmanuel argued further that the legitimacy of the political system became in good measure dependent on the legitimacy of the economic and, relatedly, the social system. In turn, the legitimacy of the economic and social systems have come to be perceived by many as dependent on the degree to which the values of equality and democracy carried by the political system would invade and transform these economic and social systems. End of quote. In the current historical moment, a new generation of scholars, such as Professor David Hines and others, are grappling with some of the same enduring questions, but in a new time. It has been over 50 years since the region embarked on the process of independence. Barbados celebrates 51 years as an independent state on November 30th this year. As Caribbean people, are we satisfied that the Independence Compact is intact? Can it withstand the compulsions of the 21st century? What does independence mean in the context of neoliberal globalization? As we grapple with such questions and more, the Department of Government, Sociology, Social Work and Psychology, Faculty of Social Sciences, has committed to keeping the legacy of Dr. Patrick Emmanuel alive. This is the 12th in a series of lectures in his name. We thank Mrs. June Emmanuel for allowing us to continue to commemorate the life and work of the late Patrick Emmanuel. Caribbean sisters and brothers, this evening is an intergenerational moment. Unlike most of our previous presenters, Professor David Hines is not a contemporary of Pat. Yet, Professor Hines would discover Pat Emmanuel through Pat's work. Professor David Hines, we especially welcome you. Thank you for accepting our invitation to deliver this year's lecture. The title of your lecture is most timely: The State of Independence in the Caribbean, Faltering Nationalism, and the Emergence of a New Caribbean Politics. I know you will provoke us to think critically about the Caribbean problematic, even as I am sure you will inspire us to draw on our inner strength to find solutions to shape our desired futures. Welcome to all of you. Before we proceed with the program, it was last year around this time that a gentleman called Mr. Leonard St. Hill was with us. And he asked a question sitting right there and collapsed and died the day after. I wish to invite you to stand as we recognize for 1 minute silence. Thank you. I now invite Dr. Tennyson Joseph, Head, Department of Government, Sociology and Social Work, to bring some opening remarks. Dr. Joseph.
Thank you, Dr. Grenade, Principal Eugene Barito and Pro-Vice Chancellor, Ambassador Roland Bullen and Mrs. Bullen, members of the Diplomatic Corps, Dean Robinson, Professor Hines, our guest speaker, Mrs. June Emmanuel, present and former colleagues of the UE family, Professor Emeritus Andrew Downs, and a former stalwart of Salises and always a regular at our Patrick Emmanuel lecture, members of the Grenada and Guyana Associations of Barbados, members of the CHAPS, Cavehill Association of Postgraduate Students, all our undergraduate students and our political science students who I hope are not here for the 5 marks that Dr. Grenade is promising, but to come and learn something more. we know you're here because of your deep interest in our topic. Members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, friends, good evening. It is once again my deep and sincere honor to be welcoming you once again to our Patrick Emmanuel Memorial Lecture. The Pat Emmanuel Lecture has become for me, and I suspect for many of you, an annual critical update and analysis of the Caribbean condition. Over the past 12 years, we have had 11 lectures, and tonight's lecture will be our 12th. I am very pleased that all of these lectures have made timely and insightful interventions into critical aspects of Caribbean life, ranging from the late Dwight Venner's discussion of the lessons and future prospects of the OECS, to Professor Horace Campbell's exploration of the changed international system and implications for the Caribbean in the 21st century, to Professor Hilburn Watson's examination of the Caribbean at the crossroads in the crisis of capitalism, and many more. All of these lectures have updated the story of the Caribbean condition while presenting us with critical insights into how we can think about the future possibilities and prospects for our Caribbean. And this is precisely one of the objectives which we had hoped to achieve, particularly for the benefit of our students when we embarked upon and we envisaged and thought about the Pat Emmanuel Memorial Lectures. We wanted our students to hear from persons who lived around and worked with Pat Emmanuel so that we could connect their generation to his ideas and worldviews and to his generation's general way of thinking about critical political questions. We are particularly pleased, too, about the quality of the speakers that we have been able to attract to our lectures. Over the past 12 to 13 years, we have had Patrick Emmanuel lectures delivered by 2 former prime ministers, 1 central bank governor, and at least 6 internationally renowned global academics of high acclaim in their respective fields and the countries of work and origin. Indeed, our last 2 presenters were our current principal of K-Ville and Pro-Vice Chancellor of the UE, Professor Eugene Barito, who we have just heard from Dr. Grenade, did a masterful treatment of Patrick Emmanuel and Caribbean political thought. And before her was Professor Emeritus Vaughan Wyss, who addressed the issue of sources of contemporary systemic and contingent threats to Caribbean state survival. I have said all of this not to put our current feature speaker, Professor David Hines, under any pressure, but to make a formal announcement that based on the quality of our speakers and the relevance of their topics, that we now have a book in formation. It is our hope that tonight's presentation by Dr. Hines will be added to our collection, and it is also our sincere hope that our next Pat Emmanuel lecture in 2018, that at that lecture we can have the book launch of as part of our activity. Before I take my seat, let me take this opportunity to specifically welcome Dr. Vasilos Sirios, who is sitting in the second row. He's a guest of the department, and we are very happy to announce that the international office, Paula Jarvis's office, because of our MOU with Finland, has organized for him to be here. And next week he'll be teaching my Western Caribbean students. His topic will be on the evolution of the modern state from Boudin right down to Locke and so forth. So we have that covered next week. And he's coming from the Finnish Center of Political Thought and Conceptual Change. So I'm very happy to have him here. Let me also specifically thank and welcome, and of course, deeply and sincerely, Mrs. June Emmanuel, and to graciously thank Mrs. Emmanuel for being here with us tonight and for adding her distinguished presence to our lecture series over the years. And I'm very, very pleased and happy to continue our relationship. Finally, let me say how excited I am about our topic for tonight, and to thank and welcome David for accepting our invitation and for, I would say, conforming to our high standards, both in person and in topic, and I am sure in content and ideas that will be generated from it. I have no doubt about that. So we look forward to learning from you tonight, David, and I want to welcome everyone, and let us all listen and learn. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Joseph. I will now invite Dr. Justin Robinson, Dean, the Faculty of Social Sciences, to bring welcome remarks.
Chair, Professor V. Dean Barreto, Pro Vice Chancellor and Principal, Ambassador Roland Bullen and Mrs. Bullen, members of the Diplomatic Corps, Dr. Joseph, our featured speaker, warm welcome, Mrs. June Emmanuel, other members of the Emmanuel family, present and former colleagues of the UWI family, especially our beloved Emeritus Professor, PVC Downs, members of the Grenada, and he's still recovering from that, members of the Grenada and Guyana Association of Barbados, members of the Grenada and Guyana Students Association at Cave Hill, members of CHAPS, our undergraduate students, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to give you a warm welcome to one of the most important events on the social sciences calendar, the annual Pat Emmanuel Lecture. We are now in our 12th edition of this. And we all look forward to really celebrating and recalling the life of Pat Emmanuel. I was reading recently that a study was done of what encouraged persons to make large donations to universities. And the single most important variable in that study was people who subsequently became wealthy, but they would have encountered a professor at that university who they felt really changed their lives. And that was the single most, it wasn't the amenities, the program, the brand, but that experience with a professor who changed their lives. And I think Pat was one of the persons who really changed lives. Pat never taught me, but as a student here, I could immediately know when one of my contemporaries had taken a Pat Emmanuel course, because their speech patterns would change dramatically. Okay? So on and so forth became just like an integral part of their vocabulary, because that's how Pat often spoke. Pat would start something and halfway started, or so on and so forth. And all of my classmates from other courses would begin copying Pat. But he clearly had a big influence on them. He never taught me, but we got along very well personally. Because I guess I have a confession. I was born in St. Vincent. I spent the first 18 years of my life there. I've spent more than half of my life in Barbados, but Grenada is my favorite island in the Caribbean. In fact, I'm looking at Tennyson, and it was only when Tennyson came back, because we were on campus together, it's only when he came back as a lecturer that he actually realized that I was not Grenadian. Because I was really immersed in the Grenadian community here as a student. I got along very well with Pat. He took me under his wing, not in an academic capacity, but we had a regular alignment thing going, and we spent many hours in the SCR, so I enjoy this. Usually when I have to give remarks here, when you see the topics here, I usually feel, as a financial economist, I usually feel a bit of a Philistine in the midst. But I'm pleased to note the introduction of neoliberal market-based measures such as offering students an incentive. I see signs of progress in a particular direction, which I applaud. Well, but it's an incentive, it's a tradable, it's a currency of sort. And I want to end my welcome by saying, despite what happened last year, please feel free to ask questions. Because your questions are an integral part. So welcome, hope you enjoy the lecture.
Thank you very much, Dean Robinson. I will now invite Mr. Joel Devonish to play a musical interlude for us. Thank you, Joel. Thanks for reminding us that we can face the future despite all the uncertainty that may be around. I now invite Dr. Alana Griffith, who is a lecturer of sociology, to introduce our guest speaker.
Good evening. Professor Eugene Barreto, Vice Chancellor and Principal of the Cave Hill campus, Ambassador Roland Bullen, members of the Diplomatic Corps, Dr. Justin Robinson, Dean, Faculty of Social Sciences, Dr. Tennyson Joseph, Head of Department, Government Sociology, Social Work and Psychology, our featured speaker, Professor David Hines, Mrs. June Emmanuel, wife of the late Dr. Patrick Emmanuel, members of the Emmanuel family, present and former colleagues of the UE family, including Professor Emeritus Professor Andrew Downs, members of the Grenada and Guyana Associations of Barbados, members of the Grenada and Guyana Students Associations at Cave Hill, members of the Cave Hill Association of Postgraduate Students, all of our undergraduate students, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Tonight I have the pleasure to introduce our featured speaker for the lecture, Professor David Hines. His bio and the blurb in your programs do little to convey the depth of the person that is David Twilly Hines. And I am sure by the end of this introduction, you may also accuse me of being guilty of the same. Nevertheless, I shall attempt to succinctly do so by exploring his passion, politics, and praxis, and commitment to people. Let me first address his praxis. It is nigh impossible to separate the political scientist David Hines, the academic, from the activist. His academic journey to the Arizona State University began with his Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of District Columbia and a MA and PhD from Howard University, also in political science. A prolific writer, he has authored over 50 conference papers, 8 book reviews, 10 book chapters, 9 peer-reviewed articles, 4 books with 1 forthcoming, and delivered over 50 public lectures. He is also a public intellectual who has regularly contributed to newspapers and radio stations across the region and in the United States. Dr. Hines' website, GuyanaCaribbeanPolitics.com, and his blog provide a wealth of information on contemporary issues that can benefit activists, researchers, policymakers, and students in the Caribbean and the diaspora. He has also won several awards for his teaching at Arizona State. While this may neatly package the academic, his days as a practitioner of political science began much earlier. Indeed, it is the complexity of his intersection of theory and practice, or his praxis, that sees him addressing us at this time. It is often said that looking back is dangerous. But for those of us who understand history's importance, we know that looking back can enhance our understanding of the present. Let me take you back to the experience of a 7-year-old Guyanese boy in the 1960s, which was a watershed period in the political history of the Caribbean. It was that period in which the West Indies Federation collapsed. That period of the Walter Rodney riots, which ushered in an era of black consciousness. Liberation music blazed on the airwaves of old transistor radios, as with pride West Indies cricketers reached beyond the boundary. The Black Power movement intermingled with a radical intellectual tradition. Caribbean radicals and scholar activists would challenge the meaning of independence for the transformation of Caribbean polities, economies, and societies. Dr. Patrick Emmanuel, whose memory we honor here this evening, was a product of that same radical Caribbean tradition. Through his teaching, research, and public scholarship, the late Dr. Emmanuel interrogated the condition of the Caribbean state, the quality of democracy and governance, and the efficacy of the electoral system. In the words of Professor Eugene Barreto, Dr. Patrick Emmanuel was not imprisoned by ideological rhetoric or an uncritical loyalty to any particular ideological framework. He questioned the assumptions of contemporary theories and philosophies, seeking to prescribe for conditions within Caribbean political economy. In this contemporary moment, researchers and scholars such as Dr. David Hines are building on the work that was done by those of Pat Emmanuel's generation. Dr. Hines' seminal essay, Beyond Formal Democracy, The Discourse on Democracy and Governance in the Anglophone Caribbean, which was published in the Journal of Commonwealth and Comparative Politics in 2008, forms part of his larger body of work on democracy, which is an extension of Pat Emmanuel's work. At this 12th Patrick Emmanuel Memorial Lecture, the title of Dr. Hines' presentation is apt. That is, The State of Caribbean Independence, Faltering Nationalism and the Emergence of a New Caribbean Politics. Now let me briefly reflect on his commitment to people and his passion. It is his passion for democracy and the political rights of his fellow Guyanese and Caribbean nationals that fuels his fire. The day that Walter Rodney was a critical moment in Professor Hines' life. The then 19-year-old young man from the village of Buxton, like Bob Marley, understood that mental imprisonment was more injurious than any physical facility designated as a prison. In his youth, he understood that literal blindness was incomparable with intellectual myopia. His passion has seen him at the front line of protests and perseverance in several causes for social justice. It is therefore not surprising that he has published the books Bob Marley Lyrics of Resistance and the forthcoming Groundings in Guyana, Walter Rodney and the Politics of Ethnicity and Resistance. These are accompanied by the journal articles Walter Rodney and Political Resistance in Guyana, revisiting the 1979-80 Civil Rebellion, and Walter Rodney's Political Praxis, the Guyana years 1974-78. Anyone familiar with Professor Hines from his membership in the Caribbean Studies Association can attest to his sense of purpose and commitment to the region and its people. Furthermore, his unpretentious and forthright defense of the powerless. The evidence lies in his publications. For instance, in Domestic Non-Cooperation and Regional Integration, Problems of Caribbean Regionalism, and Internal Political Tribalism and Regional Integration in the Caribbean. Tonight, he promises to address the deviance from the early post-independence vision and challenges all to reconsider a lost nationalist praxis. His life brings to mind the words of Martin Luther King Jr. when he said that human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Every step towards the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle. The tireless exertion and passionate concern of dedicated individuals. I present to you Professor David Hines.
Thank you so much. Professor Eugene Bartow, Vice Chancellor and Principal, Ambassador Roland Bullen, former Ambassador to Guyana, and Mrs. Bullen, the members of the Diplomatic Corps, Dr. Justin Robinson, Dean, Faculty Social Sciences, Dr. Tennyson Joseph, Head of Government and Sociology and Social Work and Psychology, Mrs. June Emmanuel, the wife of the late Patrick Emmanuel, who we remember tonight, other members of the Emmanuel family, present and former colleagues of the UWI family, members of the Grenada and Guyana Associations of Barbados, members of the Grenada and Guyana Students Associations at Cave Hill, members of the Cave Hill Association of Postgraduate Students, all undergraduate students, and it's good to have students here tonight, members of the media, Professor Andrew Dungs, ladies and gentlemen, sisters and brothers, welcome. After all that was said before, and when I look at the list of speakers that presented this lecture, I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to be at the University of the West Indies, which is one of our lasting treasures of Caribbean nationalism, one of the gifts that we have given to ourselves, and one that we should treasure. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak here tonight. You know, when I was running around as a little boy in Buxton in Guyana, if anyone told me that one day you'll come to the University of the West Indies to give a lecture, I'll tell them, go to hell. You aspire to be a teacher or to work in the government and all of that. But that I'm standing here tonight, the son of the poor and powerless, trying to say something about our Caribbean condition. Trying to say something about our Caribbean condition. I think it's a testimony to what we have done with our independence. Opening doors and opening possibilities for the underprivileged to find their way and to dance on the Caribbean stage and to paint pictures of our condition. Sometimes we think that we have not done much, but when some of us tell the story, we know that we've done quite a bit. Often when I speak at these public events, I reflect on a Caribbean that is not always comfortable with talk, even though we are talkers. Because we have had a history of talk without action, and so our people are wary of these bright people who they make sacrifices to send to school, who talk among themselves and talk about things that are not relevant to the lives of ordinary people. how do we make our talk in these halls relevant to what happens outside of these halls, I think is the perennial challenge of Caribbean scholarship. I got to Howard University in the early 1990s, and I got to the political science department, and I was introduced to the two people who were going to supervise me, Professor Hilborn Watson from Barbados and Professor John Cotman. And Professor Cotman said, well, you're coming as a Caribbean bright light is leaving us. And he was referring to Professor Eugene Barreto, who just finished her PhD at Howard. And I was told that I would have to live up, as you will. And once I began to talk about what I was interested in doing at Howard, they put together a list of authors and books that I needed to get my hands on. And among the authors was Pat Emmanuel. I wanted to study democracy and government and the state in the Caribbean. And in the process of doing so, as I said, I encountered Pat Emmanuel's work. As I agonized over the two contending schools of thought on the subject of democracy, namely those who argue that the Caribbean was a model of democracy, and those who retorted that the Caribbean was inherently authoritarian, both as a political culture and a political system, I found comfort in Pat Emmanuel's problematization of the subject. Pat Emmanuel argued that the Caribbean represented a contradiction of a democratic political values and an undemocratic economic and social hierarchy. I had grown up in a village, and I had heard that, you know, black people are contrary. And I always wondered what that meant, because I know there was something profound about it. And when I read Pat's problematization and contradiction, I realized he was talking about that contrariness that is part of our Caribbean experience. And in terms of my own academic and political growth and the way in which I observe and interrogate Caribbean reality, that notion of contradiction and contrariness has been a very important guide. I would later encounter Pat's work on democracy when I took up both at the academic and in the public sphere the subject of the limits of the Westminster system and the need for a more inclusive form of governance beyond Westminster's majoritarianism. Pat's probing of the democratic limits of the first past the post system and its implications for governance in the Caribbean was invaluable in clarifying my perspective in this regard. It is safe to say, therefore, as hinted by Dr. Griffith and Dr. Grenard, that my own academic and political work is really a continuation of the tradition pioneered by Pat Emmanuel and his generation. But above and beyond Pat's academic work and Caribbean scholarship, we are especially indebted to Pat Emmanuel for his untiring fidelity to critical analysis In particular, its critique of settled notions of knowledge. And I think this is so important. Because part of the drift that we are experiencing in our Caribbean at this moment, I think, is our veering away from the notion of critical analysis. And so I think, as we remember Pat Emmanuel and remember his example of critical analysis, I think is important. Pat Emmanuel, in the process of stressing critical analysis, helped in no small way to construct an indigenous Caribbean political thought, which was so eloquently articulated by Professor Barreto's presentation here 2 years ago. Indigenous thought is a pivotal ingredient of the essence of nationalism, which I'll come back to later on. I come to the second aspect of Pat's praxis that is most useful to the Caribbean Academy, and one which I have a direct affinity to. It is Pat as the public scholar who always sought to locate his scholarship in the broader Caribbean struggle to affirm its collective humanity, to transform itself from plantation to nation, and to navigate a world order that was and is still not accommodating to post-plantation societies. The Caribbean scholar can be other things, but he or she must be first and foremost a public scholar who, in the words of A.U.C. Quayana, must take the people's experiences, refine them, and give them back to the people as political and intellectual nourishment. Pat Emmanuel is a pioneer in the area of public scholarship, which is pivotal for us. And so this evening, in the tradition of Pat Emmanuel, I want to speak as a public scholar, an activist scholar, who views scholarship not as an end in itself, but as a potent and necessary means to the larger collective liberation of people. I believe the Caribbean scholar is central to the Caribbean socio-political and cultural motion, always questioning power. And in C.L.R. James's words, going beyond boundaries, or as Jimmy Cliff would ancestrally remind us, always crossing rivers, and Bob Marley's exhortation to disturb your neighbor. I want to disturb my neighbor. It should be no secret from what you've heard tonight that Walter Rodney's vision of the organic intellectual is central to my own conceptualization of intellectual work. Yes, intellectual work. Often we think about academics and intellectuals not as workers, but as people who are out there. But for the Caribbean, our intellectuals must be workers. So let's get to work. I choose to speak tonight on the state of the Caribbean independence, primarily because I think it is the single and most profound accomplishment of the Caribbean peoples. It has to be, for if you're enslaved and colonized as we were, you must by necessity be always thinking about freedom. And the most important plank of freedom is independence. Independence is our most important accomplishment. I want to do an interrogation of our independence journey, beginning with the final push for statehood, or what we call decolonization, beginning in the early 1950s, by looking at the defining moments and the inherent challenges, and ending with the present. As we think of the Caribbean, I think we have to think very deeply about what we represent. We're always in the face of external challenges, We're always in the face of the belief that we are not good enough, that we have not done enough, and that we are not a civilization. Dr. Rav Gonzalez always reminds us of the Caribbean civilization, and we are indeed a civilization that has contributed tremendously to world civilization. In fact, there would be no world civilization without the Caribbean contribution. You know, our young people today talk about bigging up yourself, bigging up the individual self. We've always have to be in the business of bigging up our collective self, because that is our path. That is our path to survival, always. As we approached independence after the Second World War, we were entering a world that was not created for us. When the big ones at the end of the Second World War got together in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, they constructed a world order for themselves. Barbados and St. Lucia and Grenada and Guyana and the Caribbean were not on their minds. So we were becoming independent in a world that was not made for us. It's a big challenge. It's a big challenge. And we were coming into that world bringing some things that would become important for us in the Caribbean and important for the world. We brought a history of bondage. Never forget that most of the history of the Caribbean has been a history of bondage. That is important. We cannot define who we are outside of that. To do so is suicidal and nonsensical. We also brought a history of overcoming. You know, we often talk about slavery and colonialism. We don't often talk that we overcame slavery and we overcame colonialism and we are here today. "400 years and we're still here." The history of overcoming. And the link between bondage and overcoming is the history of resistance. We in the Caribbean wrote the primer for resistance. Always resisting and overcoming. And if you are in bondage, as I said, you're constantly thinking about freedom. So we brought to the world a freedom instinct, an instinct for freedom. Professor Rex Netherford reminded us that we have not built towers and pyramids and skyscrapers. What we brought to the world is what he describes as our creative intellect and our creative imagination. Our creative intellect and our creative imagination. When you look around the world and you see Caribbean people doing things and building the world and informing the world and teaching the world and sensitizing the world, it is no accident. It's in the mind. Wonder why a Bob Marley, little boy from 9 miles in Jamaica, can speak to the world, all over the world, all kinds of people in the world, and get them to listen in the middle of the dance hall, in the middle of their celebration, to get them to think about humanity. It's our gift to the world. And if we're thinking about freedom, we're also thinking about democracy. Often we think of democracy as the Greeks gave us democracy. And we teach that to our students all the time. If people say that you are not equal and treat you as unequal, you're constantly struggling for equality. If you are nurtured in an unjust space, you're constantly thinking about injustice. If you are beat down, in order to stand up, you've got to link hands and link minds. We give the world democracy. We too give the world democracy, and we must own democracy. Our democracy comes out of our yearning for freedom and for equality and for justice. When our foreparents were planning to escape from the plantation, they sat around the fire, sat wherever they could find space, and they planned. They were engaging in democracy. Let us not surrender these things to other people. We too are Democrats. We brought to independence a sense of pluralist integration. You know, we talk about the integration movement, and I want to add something to it: pluralist integration. They enslaved us and colonized us, not just as Barbadians and Grenadians and Guyanese. It was a plantation system in these Caribbean waters. Slavery and colonialism were the epitome of what they now call globalization. We in the Caribbean understand what globalization is and what we have always been globalized. Professor Nettleford, again, I borrow from him, he said, what they now call globalization is a new name for an old obscenity. That's Professor Nettleford only. Old obscenity. And so therefore, if you are suppressed and oppressed by a global framework, you resist that suppression and that oppression with a global resistance, a resistance of integration. Integration did not start with the Federation in 1958. Integration started on the plantations. As they were planning to break out of the plantation, they made sure that they did not plan to escape from one plantation. They sent the message to other plantations. They were integrating, always seeking to be plural. Seeking to be plural. We brought to independence a radical instinct. A radical getting to the roots. The roots, not the top, not the surface. Because to beat the system, you had to uproot the system. See, slavery was not about half slave and quarter people and half slave and half people. You were a full slave in the eyes of the slave master. You were not a human being. And so therefore, to beat that, you had to get to the root. And so we brought radicalism, a radical instinct. And finally, we brought a knowledge of the world. We brought a knowledge of the world. Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican, leading the largest black mass movement global movement in the early part of the century. He's doing that as a Jamaican because he has a sense of the world. All the leading Pan-Africanists, from Henry Sylvester Williams, George Padmore, Garvey himself, Frantz Fanon, coming right through to Walter Rodney, they're thinking locally and globally. They have a sense of the world. When the trade unionists came back in the early part of the century from a conference in Europe, the Marichots and the Critchlows, they were not talking about Barbadian independence and Trinidadian independence, they were talking about Caribbean independence. Global sense of the world. I say all of that to say that Caribbean nationalism is always and has always been at the center of what we are and what we do. I know sometimes our younger scholars scorn on the term nationalism because the Europeans and the Americans tell us nationalism is bad. Nationalism is terrible. It leads to what Hitler did and all that nonsense. Well, Hitler could use nationalism to do what he did. It doesn't mean that we in the Caribbean will use nationalism for that. I define a Caribbean nationalism as the inevitable value, imagined and real, that sustains a people, connects their individual pain and aspirations, provides a lens through which they see themselves and they see the world around them, and out of which they determine their sameness and their diversities. For us in the Caribbean, ours is a history of nationalisms formed in the process of struggle to overcome constant obstacles and the persistent need to affirm our collective humanity in the face of denial. In the final analysis, it is our lasting gift to ourselves. With it, we are always pushing limits, crossing rivers, moving beyond boundaries, and surviving with dignity. Without it, we're always at the mercy of savages, never seeing properly, doubting our own capacity to survive, and surrendering to the worst construction of us by others, and to the most unliberating instincts within us. I wouldn't say nationalism is all we have, but nationalism is all we must always have. I refer to Pat Emmanuel's problematization of our democracy and his notion of contradiction. And so it'd be remiss to say all those things and not say that we also brought to independence a memory of authoritarian management of power. You see, you cannot be on the plantation for all those years, all those centuries, and not, in a sense, pick up some of the bad habits. After all, we are human beings, right? Complex. And so we brought to our independence that authoritarian management of power. We brought to independence a negative ethnicity, and I say a negative ethnicity, a negative class construction, a negative gender construction. So ethnic groups came here not as friends. The Europeans came here and they sought to control and eventually decimated the natives, the native Indians, creating that conflict. Africans were brought here in chains pitted against Native Indians, negative ethnicity. After emancipation, East Indians and Chinese and Portuguese were brought here and set against Africans, undercutting Africans. Our ethnic experience has not been a friendly experience. We've got to admit that. And there are negatives that came from that. And we brought those negatives with us to independence. Even as we struggled together, even as we tried to escape bondage together, social hierarchies, the notions of class, color, were built into our experiences, and we brought those to independence. We have just begun to talk about gender a couple of decades ago. We didn't talk much about it. But the negative consequences of gender equality, which were spawned even as we struggle for freedom, we brought those with us to independence. We brought to independence also an adoration for maximum leadership. The big man leading the children out of Israel. And our sameness and diversity, given the way in which our islands were scattered across, we develop a sense of islandness, which we also brought to independence. And so what we brought to independence was a complex tapestry that Pat Emmanuel and others tried to make sense of. But in the final analysis, we had expectations of independence. What did we want from independence? Given all that was experienced, independence had to mean a few things. First, it had to mean the fulfillment of the emancipation promise. Emancipation in 1838, final emancipation, as they say, was not full emancipation. It was the promise of emancipation. It would take us another 150 years to realize full emancipation. And that's why independence becomes important. So a final down payment on emancipation. 1834 to 1838, they said it was the apprenticeship period and that it ended in 1838. Apprenticeship did not end until the 1960s for us in the English-speaking Caribbean, beginning in 1962. Second, independence always meant for us self-definition. After a history of people defining who we are, you're a slave, you have no history, you have no culture, you're not a human being. If you are becoming independent, one of the first things you want to do is to define who you are. It's why Brother Bob, in that song, Concrete Jungle, we are what we are, and that's the way it's going to be. You can't educate I for no equal opportunity. Talking about my freedom and liberty. That's what he's talking about. It's independence. Defining who we are. Third, independence must mean and must always mean an affirmation of our humanity. What it is to be human, that's what our quest has always been. Because what enslavement and colonization meant is that somebody said that we were not human beings. And if we are becoming independent and we are not affirming, always affirming that humanity, we are not worth the independence that we're talking about. what it is to be human. We look across the Caribbean today. Violence. Violence against children, violence against women, violence against the underprivileged, and we wonder, we are slipping. What it is to be human must always be in our minds. The minute we forget that, we slip into the drift that manifests itself in all these things that we're seeing around us. Fourth, independence must mean always turning the idea of freedom into a living praxis. Transforming freedom on the mind to freedom in motion and action. You see, when you're fighting on the plantation, freedom is on your mind. You become independent, and freedom must mean something living. Freedom in motion and action. That's what our independence is all about. And finally, our independence meant and must mean transforming that resistance that I talked about earlier into a praxis of governance. You're fighting the slave master, fighting the colonial, and now your independent is about turning that resistance praxis into a democratic form of governance. Democratic form of governance. For me, those were the expectations of independence. Human beings are complex. And our Caribbean is a complex place. I'm trying to say that Pat was trying to explain that complexity. We are what we are, and that's the way it's going to be. The uprising of the 1930s, that for me is where we started the independence, the final blow for independence. Ordinary men and women standing up. They call them riots. You know, when we do things, it's always riots, the 1930s riots, the Rodney riots. And we repeat that nonsense. The uprisings by people, human beings. Enough is enough. The beginnings, the birth of the new Caribbean political movement. It was multi-class, multi-ethnic, gender silence, silent on gender, but we went along because we are pushing for freedom. Very anti-imperialist, nobody telling us what to do. We don't want big countries. They've been doing that to us all our experience. And that independence movement was a mass movement. It was people, ordinary people. It was not just the leaders. And out of that was born what we call today the modern political party, not one of our shining examples of independence, but nevertheless, it came out of us. By the early 1950s, we began to do things. And independence, you see, when we're looking for who we are, we look to the least among us. It's no accident that in Jamaica in the early 1950s, ska is born. The music of celebration accompanied by the dance, signaling that we are going to be free. Ska did not come out of nowhere. It came out of that expectation of freedom. In the early 1950s, we were going to England with a cricket team that it's now in batsmanship, bowlership, fieldership, and vision, black and beautiful. And we whipped the hell out of England, those two pals of mine, Ramadan and Valentine. You remember that? We are doing this as we are creating ska. You know, the steel band was playing here. Ordinary people in Trinidad and Tobago taking a drum and turning it into a cultural weapon. We are doing all of this as we are expecting independence. A new calypso is emerging. A new calypso is emerging. A new Caribbean literature is emerging in the 1950s. It's George Lamin and Samuel Selvon and Vidya Naipaul and Louise Bennett and Martin Carter. And all our literary beauty bursting on the scene. It's as if everything was bottled up. And now independence is coming, and out they come. Out they come. Pat Emmanuel and others are little boys, and they're growing up with this. It's no accident that they become what they become. They're growing up with this. Independence is coming. But in Emmanuel's thesis, the contradictions are there. We saw the split in the national movements. We become DLP and BLP. We become PPP and PNC. We become JLP and PNP. So even as we are dancing beautiful rhythms, we're also engaged in some ugliness. They invaded Guyana in 1953, saying that they wanted to be communists. All they were doing in Guyana was making education possible for poor people so that Walter Rodney could get a scholarship to go to Queen's College and become what he has become. That's all they were doing. All they were doing is that they were saying, let workers decide whether they want to be in a union. And the British landed troops. And our leaders cheered the British on. In the midst of our beauty, ugliness prevails. The contradiction that Pat is talking about. And so, by the time we get to the 1960s, Pat Emmanuel is now a big boy. Walter Rodney is a big boy. And all the little boys and girls of the 1950s have grown up. They've grown up in independence. They're no longer looking to empire for answers. They're looking for answers here. And they look at those who marched with workers in the 40s and the 50s and the 30s, who are now turning their guns on the very workers they marched and liberated. And Pat Emmanuel's generation said, this is not what independence is about. And so in the 1970s, 1960s, beginning 1960s, the concourse of ideas, the real discussion about what our independence, what is the content of our independence, what is the tenor of our independence. And that movement is very much part of the intellectual ferment of the time. Academics, scholars, like some of us in here tonight, are part of that movement. They're part of that movement. Asking questions. Out of that came the Black Power movement we have heard of, the 1968 uprising, October 1968, when Walter Rodney is banned from Jamaica, Caribbean man, banned from Jamaica, not for trying to overthrow the government of Jamaica, but for trying to teach black history to black people in a country that is 98% black, and being told you can't do that. Memory. I see a lot of young people here tonight. Memory. You take it for granted today that you are in a university and you are learning about big theory, and you're learning about black history and Caribbean history and all of those things. It did not come easy. Black Stalin said nothing ain't come easy. It ain't come easy. And so Walter Rodney was banned from Jamaica. And the students, some of whom are now prime ministers, decided they're going to put on their guns and march to the prime minister's residence downtown. And as they're going, they see a mass from the other side, and they wanted to know, who are they? And when they got to the corner, they saw it was ordinary people who Walter Rodney would go down in the gullies in Jamaica and talk to about black history. And they too wanted to make a statement. And the coming together of those two important forces would bring into being the radical movement, what Brother Valentino called the Roaring 70s. Beautiful period in our Caribbean journey. Beautiful period in Caribbean journey. By 1970, the students would march into the sugar belt and the oil belt and create what we now call the February Revolution, reminding us that we are a people always fighting, always pushing boundaries, always pushing back boundaries. By 1976, a South African cricketer would say to the West Indians, "We will make you grovel." And we responded. And for the next 20 years, the poorest cricketing country, the poorest, would beat the world at every twist and turn for 20 years. The longest any team dominated a team sport in the history of humanity. We in the Caribbean made that possible. We come from something, we count from something, and we are something. Bob Marley would begin his journey, a 10-year journey. Unfortunately, that would end with his life cut short by natural death. Urging the Caribbean to catch a fire. Talking to us about Exodus. Talking to us about what it means. No chains around my feet, but I'm still not free. Going to Zimbabwe and say, in 1980, soon we'll find out who the real revolutionaries. Because I don't want my people to be tricked by mercenaries. He was speaking to them in Africa, but he was also speaking for us. How long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look? Doing that, speaking to us and speaking to the world. All of this in the 1970s. The decade would begin with the mighty Duke in Trinidad singing "Black is Beautiful." And the decade would end with the Black Stallion saying, "The Caribbean Man." Calling us to action, saying that if we're talking about Caribbean unity, we've got to talk about a plan for our women and for our children. And then 1979-80, the promise of independence, where resistance will take shape. In Dominica, we told the dictator where to go. Patrick John no more. In St. Lucia, they went to the ballot boxes and created an electoral revolution that will bring into being a coalition of radicals and moderates. In Suriname, they will rise up and create the Suriname Revolution in February 1980. Suriname, okay. In Guyana, Walter Rodney would go back to teach at the university. They will tell him that again, that you cannot teach here. And he will take to the streets and teach. And in 1979-80, the civil rebellion which challenged the powers of the day. And then in Grenada, it happened. And we created our own little revolution. the roaring 70s. It was a period of beauty, but it was also a period of ugliness, because we had the rise of the authoritarian state in all its pomp and glory. Beaten back resistance. And so we have that contradiction there. And by the time we get to the 1980s, the Grenadian Revolution implodes, the contradiction we talk about. The St. Lucian experiment is gone by 1982 because the two maximum leaders could not work it out. In the midst of our cricket glory, a couple dozen of our good cricketers left and went for blood money in South Africa. We began to turn to the IMF in droves. We accepted structural adjustment, which in effect was readjusting us to coloniality. Structural adjustment. The public scholar, the Pat Emmanuel generation, is now being told in the 1980s that there are now new standards. We are becoming modern, and the public scholar is no longer useful to us. The decline of public scholarship. The political music of the 1970s would give way to the dance hall. Rub down, shove down. It was always there, don't get me wrong, but it was not dominant. By the 1980s, it's now dominant. The rise of individualism, it's me. It's me. It's not us. We're entering a period of decline. Entering a period of decline. We continue to do things. The great Brian Lara would rise and become the Prince of Port of Spain, but the West Indies was losing. Significant. Vivian Richards strolled across the world stage and we were winning. Brian Lara walked that same stage, but we are losing. Losing. Significant. Let's think about these things. And so, we are here. We are here in this moment. I would say it's a moment of agony. I think we've come too far. We've come too far to give up, but we've got to acknowledge the agony. The politics of forward thinking is replaced by a politics of emptiness. We've retreated into what I call a dangerous pragmatism. Ideology no longer means anything. You go to a BLP meeting and a DLP meeting, you hear the same thing. Which one is going to bring more foreign domination into Barbados? We are going to build 500 hotel rooms in the next 2 years. Never mind 95% of what those hotel rooms earn leave Barbados and the Caribbean. Never mind. We get in line. It's no wonder. Watch them. After each election, they get one term, and then they get kicked out. And the next side coming, you get them one term, you kick them out. What I call the politics of exchange. Well, here they have 2 terms, but they bail you on to the 2nd term. And I think it's, from all that I'm hearing, it's done. We no longer have leaders who lead with vision. We have CEOs as prime ministers. That's what we have. Political CEOs who are not given leadership. And our young people retreat into their cell phones and the iPads and all the pads that they now create. Our cricketers go away to earn money. They no longer bat and bowl for the nation. We are in a state of drift in the Caribbean. And we have to accept that we are in a state of drift. But only we can dig ourselves out of this state of drift. Only we can dig ourselves out of this state of drift. I think there are a couple of things that we can begin to do to get back to that independence promise and to get back to the independence praxis. I'm in the presence of scholars and I'm at a university. I want to challenge us in the intellectual community. I know there are managers of the universities here, but importantly, there are students here. We badly need an overhaul of the education system and education praxis in the Caribbean. We badly need that. Yes, we've come a long way. We now read books written by Caribbean people. We study Caribbean thinkers. But we don't do enough of them. In preparation for this talk, I read Professor Barito's lecture on Pat Emmanuel, and I was pained by the way in which she's pointed out that we do not use Pat Emmanuel in our system. Our students don't know of his work. So we're reading some books written by us, but I think we need to begin to change our perspective. Our perspective. You see, we've got to study the Caribbean as the Caribbean. And we have to go back to studying the Caribbean as a civilization, to study the world through the lens of the Caribbean. All those books written by Caribbean thinkers and scholars. I teach at Arizona State University, 95% white. And I get to teach James, I get to teach all the Caribbean scholars. I have my most popular course is a course called Bob Marley, Reggae and Resistance, 250 students. Taking Bob Marley's music and teaching those who colonized us about our reality. We got to do that in our Caribbean system. We've got to overhaul our praxis. And most of all, we've got to link again our scholarship to social reality. Caribbean scholarship means nothing if it does not contribute to progress in the Caribbean. It means absolutely nothing. It means absolutely nothing. In my own country, Guyana, they found oil and they're beginning to pump it in 2020. And it's now dawning on us that Trinidad had oil and went through the same thing, and it's just next door. But we never paid attention to Trinidad. And now we're beginning to pump oil and realize that the oil will be pumped out of Guyana because we never prepared. We never learned from our own experiences. We never learned from our own experiences. You know, when I was a little boy in my village, Clive Thomas and Walter Rodney and others would come to speak. And we, young people, little boys and girls, we wanted to hear Walter Rodney. But whenever Clive Thomas was coming, the farmers would come out from the backlands early. And they would come to the middle of the village and sit down and wait. And I always wonder, why they want to listen to Clive Thomas, who was not as, fiery and eloquent as Walter. And later on I realized that Clive Thomas was talking to them about sugar. They were cane farmers. He was talking to them about sugar economics. Where are our scholars among the banana farmers in St. Lucia? Or among the cane farmers in Guyana? Among the oil workers in Trinidad? Talking to them about their experiences, learning from them. That's where we've got to put part of our scholarship. We've got to get back there. I want to end with Caribbean integration. Because one of our glorious moments of the 70s was the Caribbean integration that we brought up. And you see, the Caribbean has to be in motion always. Because we are Barbadians. We are Guyanese. We are Trinidadians. We can't avoid that. But when Usain Bolt goes on that track and begins to do his thing, the Barbadian becomes West Indian. The Barbadian becomes West Indian. All of us become West Indian. I'm saying for Caribbean integration to flourish as we all want it to flourish, we've got to create the conditions for it to flourish. We understand that there is a bench for Guyanese at the airport here. But I remember that there was a cricketer from Guyana named Carl Llewellyn Hooper. And when he strode out at Kensington Oval, the Barbadians owned him. They call him Sir Carl. Our contradiction in motion. We've got to create the conditions. We can't sit back and believe that the Barbadian will automatically become West Indian or the Grenadian will become West Indian automatically. We've got to make the Caribbean real. Scholars have to find ways and means of linking their scholarship. You know, as West Indians, we go to our graves for the last 20-odd years. I am very certain of this. You know, we died 5 years earlier, fighting up behind these West Indies cricketers. They win a match, and then we say, all right. And then for the next match, blood pressure go up. They're killing us. But those boys are recruited from among us. They're coming from our societies. It's here, we are producing them. So we've got to go back to a place where we produce cricketers who will make us live longer. In a sense, they're saying to us, you abandoned us. The nation has abandoned us. And why do you want us now to bat for the nation? They're asking questions. Our politics, as I said, I don't know. But there's some things we can do. Pat Emmanuel didn't like the first past the post system. He felt that it was an affront to democracy. Perhaps we should begin to now look at a mixed system that brings together the first past the post and the PR system. Guyana has the PR system, but not first past the post. So perhaps we can begin to talk about a mixed system. We can begin to talk about local democracy. I was talking to a young student yesterday, was there, who she's very interested in the cooperatives. What you all call it in St. Lucia? Kudume. Using that and elevating the local into a national praxis. So perhaps we can begin to look at local democracy again. I feel very strongly that we should have in our political system an affirmative action for women. And let me explain what I mean. In Guyana, after long struggle, we managed to get them to agree that 30% of all the electoral slates that a party puts up, 30% must be women. And it's in the laws of Guyana now. It's not satisfactory. I would like to see us institutionalize that in the Caribbean. To find a way to get women. You see, we say, well, women must come to the forefront. Well, after centuries of telling women that your place is not in the forefront, but in the background, and you expect them now to come to the forefront. You did? So we've got to create institutions in order to make these things possible. So I think there ought to be affirmative action for women in the political process. I also think that we need to think very seriously about overseas voting. It's contradictory, it's frowned upon in some places, but we can't say to Guyanese and Barbadians and other West Indians who overseas, all you're all good for is to send your barrel and send your remittances. But not finding a way to provide them with incentives to participate in the political process. In the age of technology, you don't have to be in Barbados to participate in what's happening in Barbados. I sit in my office or in my living room and I'm on the TV in Guyana every week. It's possible. And so therefore I think we should begin to think about some form of participation. If you argue, if you say to me, well, Dr. Hines, they don't pay taxes so they can vote. Well, they got plenty Bajans too poor to pay taxes, and plenty Guyanese too poor to pay taxes. You want to tell them not to vote? I think we have to think deeply about these things. The remittances that we get from them are more than the taxes if they were here. And so we've got to find new ways of engaging old subjects. One of my pet projects is power sharing. I think the days of opposition and government have long been over. It's long been over. I think we should get rid of that. It's holding us back. The BLP is going to come in and probably spend a term or two, and they're going to start all over again. And then when you kick them out 5 years, the next one come in, you start all over again. And the rest of the world is running away from us. We've got to find a way to make the so-called opposition into an active participant in the political process. Here I invoke the definition of democracy authored by our own Arthur Lewis, in which he argued that democracy must mean that all those who are affected by a decision must participate in making that decision. And if 49% of the population vote for another party and the 51% controlling all the decision making, it is not democracy. And so here we are. Here we are. In this moment of despair, but out of it must come a commitment for hope. At the end of the day, these islands and mainland countries are going nowhere. We are going to be here, and we've got to make this work. But all of us, from all stations, have to become part of it. And you young people, you've got to take up the mantle. All those people that you all hear about, the Barrows and the Grantley Adams, and they were little boys and little girls in their 20s like you all. Walter Rodney died at 38. Pat Emmanuel was in his 20s and was beginning to do things. Young people must own this space. You know, perhaps what I'm trying to say is best put by one of the authentic poetic voices of the Caribbean, Martin Carter, in one of his shortest poems. He said, "This I have learned, today a speck, tomorrow a hero. Hero or monster, you are consumed. Like a jig shakes the loom, like a web is spun the pattern. All are involved, all are consumed." Thank you much.
Bonsoir tout le monde. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Very true to our Caribbeanness, we often don't say something once, we say it twice and maybe even 3 times. So permit me to highlight a few points as we bring what has been a very passionate, edifying and humanizing lecture to a close. I wish to draw from our chair, Dr. Grenade, who mentioned that this was an intergenerational discourse. But beyond that statement, it has to be one that is interclass, regional, institutional, informal, and community-oriented. Our speaker has left us with responsibility to share our knowledge and consciousness, opening what we've learned today to those who do not have the opportunity to sit where we sit here today. We must be able to walk our talk here and everywhere we go, to teach about ourselves and our luminaries like Patrick Emmanuel and others within our classrooms and in our homes. As he also noted, we must be able to confront our contradictions while preserving our own dignity as Caribbean people. In speaking about our governance systems and the people in which they impact, it's also important that we analyze who is it working for and what needs to be changed about it. As we learned in international relations, theory is always for someone and for some purpose. That's according to Robert Cox. And off of this, it's important to know that knowledge is not always truthful, so it must be contested and assessed and created again. As Dr. Hines reminded us, identity and independence are interrelated. It's also an ongoing process. We recognize the dualism of our bondage and resistance, both man-made and natural as well. It is important that we tell ourselves and our children all these stories, the combination of what we've inherited and the new histories that we create today. Our Caribbean nationalism is complex, it's multi-layered, it's inclusive, it's robust. It is all that we are and all the stories that come into being to make us who we are today. And while we speak of a period of agony, I would hope that that period is temporary as we go through many seasons as a Caribbean people. And as we move from a position of hope and strength, we know that we are capable of creating better if we choose to. But we must remember who we are building and creating for. As I stand before you, I think of my 5-year-old niece and 13-year-old nephew. I also want to think about the 9-year-old who was murdered in Grenada and all the children that we come into spaces with, inclusive of ourselves, as we close this lecture and reminding us of who we are and all that we have to do as a Caribbean people. And as I close, I wish to extend my gratitude to the head and staff of the Department of Government, Sociology and Social Work. We also want to give thanks to Ms. Yvette Tull and all our ushers and hard workers who enabled this to be a very smooth and wonderful process. The Office of the Campus Registrar, the Office of Public Information, Education Media Services, Maintenance Department, Campus Security, yourselves as a listening and attentive audience, and especially Dr. Hines for a very passionate and heartfelt lecture. And I now invite you to receive a small token of our appreciation for bringing all that you will to this lecture and more.